Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Be My App webinar series. It is a pleasure having all of you here. We'll be starting in 2 short minutes. So once again, we'll be starting in 2 short minutes, folks. Hi, everyone. I'm Fernando from Be My App, and once again, it's awesome having all of you here. Uh, in this webinar series, we have Selena from New York. She's head of product management at Order Groove. And with that, she's going to be speaking on lean principle and methodology. So anybody who's working at a startup, this is perfect for people who just want to learn how to build a proper product with the least resources as possible, but I'll let the professional do the work. So without further ado, I'll give the mic and screen to Selena. So Selena, the screen and mic is all yours.
Great, thank you. Just make sure we're all going here. Great. I hope everybody can hear me well. Thank you for having me. As I was just introduced, my name is Selena. I'll be talking to you about lean product development principles. I know it's 6 o'clock in the afternoon for you guys on a Thursday, so don't worry, this will be a sort of a leisurely overview of some steps that really anybody can take, whether you're a product manager or not, towards making sure that you have a leaner product process and that you're building the right product. So before I get to Lean, just a little bit of background about me, so you can sort of understand where my learnings are coming from. My name is Selena. I worked for, I started my career in a company called L.E.A.N, which is, it's an online job site. And what's interesting about them is that I was with them for quite a while, and the company transformed from like a very rigid waterfall company, like 9-month marches to the big grand release date. And then started to introduce agile development practices, first on the tech team, but then of course once the developers started working in an agile way that required change from the rest of the organization. And we had some really smart people working with us, and we started to sort of figure out, like, how do we make agile UX and how do we expand the agile principles throughout the organization, till we got to the point where we sort of felt we had a pretty decent lean practice. After I left the Ladders, I joined Order Groove. That's where I am right now. Order Groove is a B2B startup. So quite unsurprisingly, it was initially very sales driven, because the first step that the founder had to do was just get connections with companies that he was trying to sell to. But over the past couple of years, we've been introducing stronger product and UX practices. My Twitter handle is DZISHN, only slightly less complicated than my last name, but please feel free to reach out. I won't be checking Twitter right now over the next hour, but I'll definitely be checking in later. And if you have any follow-up questions or thoughts, don't hesitate to reach out. So Lean. I think like most people, I first heard the Lean practices articulated from Eric Ries in the Lean Startup book. But there have been many books written on Lean, Lean UX, Lean customer development, Lean analytics, Lean this, Lean that, because we struck on something interesting there, which is this idea of making sure that we're doing smart work, not just hard work. It was also, there's this, I don't know how much this has been happening in Europe, but in New York, certainly, and generally in America, but definitely in New York, several years ago, there was this explosion where everybody was talking about Lean, and any conference you go to, people would be frankly bragging about what a great job they'd done with their products. Because they applied Lean principles. There was even this company called Lean Startup Machine that printed up a bunch of these stickers that say, what took you 6 months took me 3 days. And those started popping up on conferences. And I remember seeing one of those for the first time and just going like, damn, like, what am I doing wrong? Because it's definitely still taking me 6 months to do some things, right? And so, I was hearing a lot of these like success stories of incorporating Lean startup practices. And that's natural. That's what people go to conferences to share. But at the same time, I would go back to work, the following Monday and feel like any of the things that I was trying to incorporate that I'd learned at these conferences or read in these books were like a Sisyphus, pushing a boulder up a mountain. And in the kind of stress and hecticness of the day-to-day startup work, where that one morning you have to finalize a business plan, and then that afternoon you want to like wrap up wireframes so the developers can proceed with building stuff, and then the following day you have to like have like client meetings, and in that hecticness, it started sometimes to seem to me that some of the practices recommended in all these books were really like meant to work for spherical cows in a vacuum, and I couldn't quite see how they could translate into the day-to-day reality that I was in and that my coworkers were in. And so what I'd spent a lot of time doing in addition to reading all of those books was like really trying to get sort of back to the core idea of Lean, because I kind of understood finally that just because a particular process had worked for somebody else's project or somebody else's company, that doesn't mean that that exact same process will translate into my company and my project. And so really started to like go back to basics, right? To figure out how I can incorporate the Lean like thinking, if not necessarily explicitly the practices. So, what's Lean at its core, right? It's sort of various ways to say it, but basically this cycle of build, measure, learn, right? And I actually like to think that we start from learning, because you learn that your customer has a problem, and then you develop a hypothesis for what product could possibly solve that problem, and then you build ideally the absolute smallest, fastest thing that kind of encompasses your idea, and you put it out there into the world, and then you measure, like, did this solve the problem or not? Did it solve half a problem? Did it solve any problem at all? And based on what you learn from the interactions of your customers with your product, you decide how to move forward, right? Maybe you're onto something and you solved like a good chunk of the problem, but there's a little ways to go. Or maybe you learn you solved the entire problem, and that's very exciting. Or maybe you learned that you completely missed the boat, and then you're really glad that you didn't spend 6 months building something, because in 3 days you found out that your idea wasn't the right idea to solve the customer problem. So this basic idea of build, measure, learn, or learn, build, measure, I think it is not just at the core of Lean product development. It's also at the core of incorporating Lean practices into your organization, because Lean, Agile, any process, any sort of philosophy or framework for doing our work, it won't just be accepted because, like, hey, it's like a neat idea and this guy published a book about it, right? It'll be accepted if it actually solves an organizational problem, right? And I think, that was one of my personal early mistakes was that I was trying to squeeze these processes that sounded good into my organization, but my organization didn't necessarily have that same problem that, you know, somebody else's did. And that's why there wasn't a fit there, right? I actually ended up also finding a very helpful definition of lean in a book called Lean UX, written by Jeff Gothelf and Josh Sadin. And I was actually fortunate enough to work with Jeff Gothelf at the Ladder, so I spoke with him a lot about this. And I really liked how they articulated that Lean UX, you know, it's not necessarily a bunch of processes or steps that need to be taken in the right sequence, right? It's really the practice of bringing the true nature of a product to light faster. Right? So like the core of what you're trying to build, bring it to light faster in a collaborative, cross-functional way that reduce the emphasis on thorough documentation while increasing the focus on building a shared understanding of the actual product experience being designed. So like, in other words, you know, like, let's not like have one team come up with the idea and spec it out and say this is how it should work, and then have another team build it and then like see what happens, right? It's about working together to understand, you know, what are we trying to create here, and what's really the core of it, and how do we get rid of all the bells and whistles so that we can focus on the smallest thing that we need to build, and then build that quickly, right? And what really stood out to me is these notions of like the true nature of a product, that the process itself needs to be collaborative and cross-functional, and then the emphasis is on shared understanding rather than like any specific documentation or process for that matter. So I kind of like went, I guess, meta on this definition, and thought about how this actually also describes how you could introduce lean into the organization, right? So what if we say lean is the practice of bringing the true nature of a process to light faster in a collaborative, cross-functional way still, that reduce the emphasis on specific steps while increasing the focus on building a shared understanding of the work experience being designed, right? So like, how do we productively talk about how do we want to work together? What are the problems with the way that we work together now? Why are those problems important to solve, and how can we solve them? And then we can like borrow inspiration from conferences and books to try any particular process. But what's most important is to understand the true nature of what we're trying to achieve. So, you know, I kind of set up this framework in my head where, you know, lean practices help you build a product for your customers, right? But if I'm trying to develop the lean practice within my company and within my team, then really my customers are my team, and the product we're building is our work experience. And our vision is really straightforward. We want to build stuff that matters, right? You can phrase this any number of ways. We want to build stuff that solves meaningful problems. We want to build stuff that makes us a lot of money quickly and allows us to exit. But like one way or another, you're basically saying, you know, we want to get to our goal fast, and we want every step that we take to matter. And then we stick to that same idea of you know, learn, build, measure, or reframed as like define the problem, define the hypothesis, run as small an experiment as you can, and then measure it and see whether you want to persevere or pivot, in the words of Lean, right? So I'm going to tell you 3 stories about, you know, how I sort of applied this to some very specific organizational problems that I've seen my company struggle with in the past, but I've also heard from a lot of other people that they struggle with these things. So we're going to talk about setting KPIs. We're going to talk about vetting assumptions when we build products, and we're going to talk a little bit more broadly just about experimenting with new approaches in general, right? So if your organization or your team has this problem, right, that we can't measure the impact of our work, we spend however much, a week, a month, a year building something, we release the product, and we're not totally sure if it worked or didn't, right? Or we're not sure what worked and what didn't, right? Well, okay, if the problem is that we can't measure the impact of our work, or we're not sure that it's impactful, then like my hypothesis is that let's just set some clear KPIs, key performance indicators, and that would help us measure the impact, right? It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. If your organization doesn't have this problem, then like you don't want to bother with this step, right? But if your organization does have this problem, the hypothesis that I would start with is like, let's just start measuring. And One thing that I think some people also get stuck on is like, well, how do I do lean, or how do I do KPIs, or how do I do anything like exactly the right way, right? Well, like, don't stress about that so much, because remember, again, for this to succeed, it really needs to be collaborative, which means that you can't figure it out on your own, nor are you supposed to. But if you kind of take a stab, you run that first experiment, you build that smallest thing, you start measuring something, anything, really, almost anything. Define some way that you think it makes sense to measure that your customers care about something. It can be signups, it can be site visits, it can be a lot of other things, right? And you can certainly do a lot of research on this to see what might be the best stab. But my recommendation is just set a KPI, just get going, right? Start measuring something, start talking to people about it, start telling people when the number goes up, start telling people when the number goes down, start talking to people about what have we done recently? Could that have resulted in this number going up or down, right? Start engaging people with this idea of, here's a metric that we need to pay attention to because it tells us whether our work is having a positive impact or not. Now, in the context of building a product, right? Like, you would build a product, you would release it, and then you would look at this number and say, like, great, did the number of customers who care go up or go down or stay the same, right? And that's how you measure the impact. And when it comes to processes, what you're measuring is your organization's response to what you just did, right? So if you put a KPI out there, there's really 3 outcomes. One, nobody says anything. Nobody notices, they don't think it's very interesting. And in that case, I would say it sounds like KPIs is not what your company needs at this very moment. Either the organization doesn't have the problem that you thought it had, or they're not ready to tackle that problem. But either way, if people don't engage with you and you can't create that like collaborative work towards a leaner process, then this might not be something to harp on right now. On the other hand, if people ask you about it and they kind of like the KPI that you chose, like, great, now you have a KPI and you can measure the impact of your work. And lastly, maybe people will ask you about it, but say like, what do you mean customers who care? Like, that's vague, that doesn't really make any sense. Like, I think we need to come up with a better KPI, let's work on it together. Fine, that works great too. As far as introducing a lean process, as far as introducing metrics that guide your work, 2 out of 3 of these scenarios I would call a success, because again, you've created that atmosphere, you've created the situation where you're collaboratively figuring out how do we measure the impact of our work with specific KPIs. Now, another problem that I hear a lot of, especially development teams, complain about is, hey, we never get to this phase 2. We abandon projects before we really get to finish them, and all the value, all the fun stuff, all the great things that we were going to build are pushed off into this infamous phase 2 that never really happens, right? And this can be very frustrating, but I think it's also revealing that maybe the team didn't in the beginning align on, well, what is the value that we're trying to build, right? And my hypothesis here for the organization is that if that, MVP is the term that Eric Ries would use in Lean Startup, in a minimally viable product, but MVP, first iteration, version 1, whatever you call it, whatever that first step you take, if it were smaller, so you could do it quickly, and if it were testing the right assumption about the value that we're creating, then the team could easily get buy-in to persevere and get to phase 2 and 3 and 4 and 7. Or they'll happily pivot away because they'll learn that what they thought was valuable is in fact not, right? And whenever I talk about this specific hypothesis and whenever I talk about MVPs, there's a very specific image that I really like to use. And I apologize to the person who originally published this because I've seen it now in so many places that I can no longer find the original creator. But I think it's a really, really good image to explain this notion of a minimum viable product, right? So a lot of companies still build products what I'll call the top way, right? So if you convince yourself that what you need to do is build a car, and then you immediately jump to thinking about the efficiency of your production, right? So you're like, great, I'm gonna have people who are experts at building wheels, I'm gonna have people who are experts at building chassis, or if I don't have those experts, at least I'm gonna focus in my organization on making all the wheels that I need, and then I'm gonna make all the chassis that I need, and then eventually we'll assemble a car, right? And the problem with that, of course, is that it takes forever. And by the time that you've released the car into the market, you know, in this particular image, we have a happy face suggesting that the customers are happy with what they got, but we know that that's not always the case. And by this point, you've set up your organization to be good at building cars, and you've invested so much in building this car, and you probably laden it with a ton of different features that it's hard to tell like what's working and what isn't, what is valuable and what isn't. On the other hand, you know, there's this other approach of the minimum viable product where, you know, you build like a skateboard and then a scooter and et cetera, and you finally make it to a car, right? So what I like about this image is that people look at it and go sort of like, ah, yes, like this makes so much sense. Of course I would want to take the bottom approach because, you know, this is a way to deliver value to the customer throughout. It's a way for me to make sure that the next step is worth taking and that the investment is going to pay off. I'm getting feedback throughout the process, so I'm learning about what is and isn't valuable to my customers. Like, of course, this makes a lot of sense. Now, the tricky thing also about this image is that it's a little bit deceptively clear in that you can look at the bottom of the picture and you see these 5 objects and you're basically mentally processing like, okay, like what do all these have in common? Like they get me from place A to place B faster than I would get there by walking. And because it's very clear to see when you look at 5 things, what they have in common, it makes a lot of sense why the skateboard is an MVP of a car, right? Because again, like that's the value that they all give to the customer, getting me from A to B faster. But then like from the skateboard to the car, we've of course added other sort of peripheral values to meet additional customer needs, right? So like maybe when you know, when we released the skateboard and the scooter and even the bike, somebody said like, this is all well and good getting from A to B faster, but like, can we please make it a little comfier? My ass is killing me. And so that's how you get like the comfy bike seat and eventually car. So this entire like notion of, you know, recognizing what the core need for the customer is, which is in this example, getting places faster. This process assumes that like you understand this customer need, that you want to get places faster. You understand how it helps you meet business goals, right? Like if people want cars and we can sell them for more than it costs to make them, then we'll make money, great. And then because you understand the customer needs and you understand your business goals, like you come up with a bunch of ideas and figure out which one is the fastest to test, right? So customer need is to move faster, business goal is to make money. There's lots of ideas, and you put a wheel on anything, it'll move faster than humans walking. And then you sort of triage it to the place where you say like, well, a skateboard is really cheap to make. So if it turns out that we were wrong about the customer need, we didn't waste a lot of money. And if it turns out we were right, like we can still probably, you know, sell it at a higher cost than it costs to make it. But here's what happens instead. You know, your CEO, your boss, your coworker, the sales guy, somebody in the organization comes to you with an idea, right? Like, hey, you know what would be cool? We should totally do this. We should totally build X, right? We should totally build a car. And that's kind of inevitable. It's damn near impossible, and I certainly haven't seen a team that truly always sticks to thinking from left to right, from thinking about the customer needs and then generating ideas. It's inevitable that somebody in the organization is coming to you at some point with like, hey, I think this is a cool idea. And that's okay, just work with that. Right? Just work with that and kind of like moonwalk them back towards the customer needs that they think that they're solving, right? So somebody says we should build a car or whatever. There's a number of ways to vet the assumptions that they're implicitly making about what the customer needs or what the business is trying to accomplish, right? So one, how would customers use it? What would they achieve, right? So like, you're trying to suss out, you know, if somebody tells you we should build a car with comfy seats that goes really fast and has air conditioning, right? Like, well, what of all these things really, really matters, right? Because I don't want to build all of it at once. I want to build the one that is the sort of the capital value, right? The core value. So how would customers use it? What would they achieve? why is it important to them to achieve that? And what have they said to make you think that, right? Like, why are we drawing these conclusions, right? How many have said it? This is also important. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, over the weekend, somebody talked to their neighbor and decided that if their neighbor said they would use their great product idea, then like surely everybody would use it. But their neighbor is not necessarily representative of the company's target audience. So it's really important to make sure you understand like what have people said and how many have said it. And then of course it's an opportunity to get in touch with some of them and hear sort of directly from the horse's mouth what they're talking about and what problem they're trying to solve. There's also the question of the business, right? What will it do for us? And when do we need to deliver on that? So sometimes I'm assuming that the people in my audience are sort of for-profit. But even if you're in a nonprofit, I think, it's always important to make sure that you're solving the biggest problem that you have. So the answer of what will it do for us doesn't necessarily have to be, it'll make us more money. In for-profit companies, it is, but maybe it'll help us attract more customers. It'll help us create more awareness about this, social or economic problem. The goals can vary certainly, but it's important to recognize whether this cool idea, even if customers are interested in it, what will it do to further the company's mission? And then when do we need to deliver on that is a critical question for startups, especially because all companies of all sizes feel like they have limited resources because there's always more work than people. But I think for startups especially, nothing is more dangerous than to say, well, we have to do it at some point, so we might as well do it now. You don't have much of a runway when it comes to the money. And so it's really important that you're always working on the absolutely most important thing at the moment. If you don't have to do it now, leave it for later. It may not be a problem that grows to be big enough to ever be addressed. It may become bigger next year. You'll deal with it next year. So it's really important to check for this. Like, why do we think we need to do this right now? And then a couple of like negative questions that I've started using that I found really helpful in terms of, again, illuminating, like, what are we trying to solve for? What is this value that we think we're creating? And as long as you can sort of like get past, people looking at you like you're an idiot, you ask these questions, I really think you get interesting answers. So one is, what happens if we don't do it? The competitors will do it is not a helpful answer. But what you're really trying to get to the bottom of is, how is the world going to be a worse place because we didn't do this, right? How is our company going to like crash and burn if we don't do it? How are the customers going to be absolutely miserable if we don't do it? How are we going to, miss the opportunity to set ourselves up for some sort of important growth step if we don't do it? And you'll find that for, like 99 out of 100 ideas, the answer is nothing disastrous. And again, because you have a limited runway, you really, really want to focus on doing things that avert disasters or that create really monumental wins. And then if you're really finally considering that you should do it, that you should build the car or whatever the idea was, ask how we could screw it up. Typically, again, I think, this is just human nature. We're so great at getting ourselves like psyched up and excited about our ideas and how, what's great about this is that it'll solve everything and it'll do this and this and this and 17 other things. And what's difficult about that is that, again, like 17 things will take a while to build. What's really the one thing, the one problem that this idea is solving, the one core value that it's delivering? And how can we get to the bottom of that so that we build that skateboard and not start building a bunch of wheels and a bunch of chassis for a car? So we commonly talk about what does success look like. Again, I think like this is especially true in America. There's a very sort of positivist culture, and we want to know what success looks like. But it's tremendously helpful to understand what failure looks like because, this is where the person who came to you with the idea to build a car with comfy seats and music and air conditioner and a sunroof, when you ask how we could screw it up, they typically don't say any of those extra features. They say like, yeah, imagine if we built a car and it didn't even run, right? It didn't move. And that really then tells you what is the key value that you're delivering. So again, back to my original point here is you're trying to create a situation where the team is collaboratively figuring out what is it that we are trying to build. So when you start asking these questions, again, three things can happen. One is they'll just talk themselves right out of it, which really is just tells you that it wasn't an important enough problem and not an important enough idea if they're not willing to fight for it. They'll help you ask questions. This is great. Now you're collaborating. And of course, the best is that they'll help you get answers, right? So they'll put you in touch with those relevant customers. They'll show you the business plan that shows, how it's important to achieve the milestone that this product idea will help us achieve in order to grow the business further. Now, sort of expanding beyond specific examples of measuring or vetting ideas, measuring the impact of work or vetting ideas, I think something I hear a lot is it's really hard to try new practices. People don't even necessarily articulate it quite like that. They really just say, this is how we've always done things, so that's how we're going to continue to do them. Again, this is understanding human nature, and we are creatures of habit, and things that we believe worked in the past, we believe will work in the future. And so it's very hard to initiate and accept change. But I think what I want to call out is that it's really important that we articulate the problem instead of dictating the solution, and then we'd make an impact sooner. So what I mean by that is, as a product manager, for example, like I say this sentence all the time. This is what I'm coaching my team all the time, right? Like, don't tell me what product you want to build. Tell me what problem we're trying to solve. This is what we keep telling our sales teams, our business colleagues, our clients, right? Like, thank you for coming to me with the idea, but help me understand, like, help me articulate the problem you're trying to solve, and then we'll come up with the right idea and the right product to build. So the same is true in organizations, right? You can't just kind of barge in and say like, we're going to do MVPs and we're going to do, measure KPIs and that's how we're going forward, because people won't understand like why this is important to do. So organizationally, just like in all building products, you want to make sure that you articulate the problem. So for example, these are things I have actually said to my teams. We have a lot of features we want to build and we're not sure how to prioritize, and we wish we could learn what resonates with customers before deciding. This is a great way to very clearly articulate to somebody who hasn't done user testing before how and why you need to use user testing as part of your process, right? And it doesn't get into, telling them about how lean customer development works. It's not about any buzzwords. It's not about things that they don't understand. It's about a very accessible and a problem that we can all appreciate, which is there's a lot of work to do and we're not sure how to prioritize it. Another one is, we often work under deadlines that we don't always understand. And I've seen teams definitely waste a lot of energy and frustration because of the deadline. But it's very helpful to simply acknowledge, like, look, I'm afraid the deadline is here to stay. I know that makes you scared that like all the valuable ideas that you think are important are going to get pushed off into that infamous phase 2, and you're never going to get to work on them. But my question is like, okay, like if the deadline is here to stay and we have limited time, then how do we make sure that we build something that matters in the time that we have? Tell me about this value that you perceive. Tell me why you think it's so important. Tell me what customer needs is going to meet. Tell me what business goals it's going to further. And then we can make sure that it's prioritized for this phase 1. Or even something as silly as running into technical problems. We were doing this at the Ladders. We were doing a lot of usability testing on our QA site, and the data was all rubbish. And so people were so distracted by made up job titles that they couldn't really get us good feedback on how easy it is to, for example, like run a search to find a job. run a search for job postings. And so again, sort of just voice the problem. And somewhere between, QA and dev, somebody figured out how to give us a dump of fresh data into our QA environment. And then we had realistic looking job postings, and we were on our merry way learning about how people interact with our search interface. So being lean can definitely be hard. But I think, to sort of summarize both what I think is the lean process in terms of building products, but also what it takes to introduce lean practices into an organization, is articulate the problem, demonstrate the first experiment, and then people will join us in learning how to make our work more valuable. And hopefully we will all feel like we're doing very epic shit at our work. So that's it for my presentation. Again, my name is Selena. My last name is pronounced Hadzibabic, but don't let that stress you out. My Twitter handle is DZISHN. And I believe we're going to see if any of the guests of Be My App have any questions for me now.
Selena, I greatly appreciate it. Thanks for letting us know. Currently, I think you did an awesome job explaining it, because everyone has it well understood. For anyone else that does have any questions after this video is published, do feel free to contact Selena directly, or if you want, you can just let us know in the comment section, and I will always be happy just to contact her, so she can put some input on your questions. And with that, Selena, once again, thank you very much. It was very insightful. It definitely taught me about lean and how to cut basically management to the bare necessity. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say again, thanks to everyone who showed up. Thanks to the speaker, and have an awesome day, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.